It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the ICME Mathematics Education Reform Post-2020 Conversations Towards Building Back Better panel discussion. Our panelists are myself, Mellony Graven, Marcelo Boba, Eva Jablonka, Danny Martin, and Kay Subramanian. And our respondents are Renuka Vithal and Yoshinori Shimizu. I will introduce them shortly. So in our panel, we are going to provoke conversation about directions for mathematics education reform post-2020 with a view towards building back towards better quality and equitable mathematics teaching and learning. This connects well to this year's International Maths Day theme, which was Mathematics for a Better World. We look forward as we begin to emerge from the crippling challenges of the pandemic. We've been asked to look at two interrelated aspects for building back better. The first relates to transitions towards remote and online teaching and learning in maths education, while the second relates to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals established in 2015 with the aim to build a better future by 2030. It is interesting to note that the phrase build back better initially emerged from the United Nations Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015. Online learning transitions have rapidly sped up due to the massive COVID-linked closure of and disruption to schools across the globe. Online learning, of course, brings opportunities for increased access to quality maths education resources, but it also brings danger in the enormous unevenness in the systemic and individual preparedness of those to optimize online opportunities. This unevenness then plays out both across and within countries. And so as panelists, we ask, will the digital divide exacerbate inequities across gender, social class, race? What mathematics education reform is needed to meet digital needs and growing risks created by widespread access to fake news and social media? How can mathematics education reform support the reduction of rather than the exacerbation of social, economic, and educational inequalities? There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals for building a better future, and they are pretty broad, the fourth of which is quality education. And many of them focus on the reduction of inequalities. Now, most countries across the globe are signatories on the SDGs. However, 5 years on, we're far behind meeting the goal targets. The impact of COVID has seemingly exacerbated the challenges. The digital era and its increasing visibility to racial, environmental, and other crises brings increased awareness towards the need for change. For example, increasing exposure of extreme systemic racial inequality gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. And while this movement began in the United States of America, it gained momentum across the globe. And so these crises come with opportunities, as is reflected in the characters making up the Chinese word for crisis. From my understanding, the first represents danger, while the second represents a pivot or a crucial point of change. And we have the opportunity to look at this current moment in time as a pivot and a crucial point of change for us in mathematics education. But what might that mean if we want that change to be for building back better? And so we ask, how might our common and diverse experiences of 2020, including but not limited to the pandemic, provide opportunities for building back better and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals? How does mathematics education support building back better for a better world? And so I'll now begin to introduce my panelists. Marcelo Boba is a professor of the graduate program in mathematics education and of the mathematics department of Sao Paulo State University, UNESP, at Rio Claro, Brazil. He researches the use of digital technology in mathematics education, online distance education, modeling, and critical mathematics education. He's an associate editor of ZDM, the International Journal of Mathematics Education, and is editor of a collection of 32 books in Brazil. Eva Jablonka is a professor of mathematics education at Freie Universität Berlin, Department of Education and Psychology. She has held positions at King's College London, Luleå University of Technology Sweden, and the International Centre for Classroom Research at Melbourne University. Her research looks at the goals of mathematics and mathematics literacy education, mathematics classrooms in different educational systems, and she has contributed significantly to sociocultural theories in mathematics education. Danny Martin is a professor of education and mathematics at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He teaches in the undergraduate elementary education program, as well as courses in the doctoral programs in mathematics and science education and curriculum studies. His research focuses primarily on understanding the salience of race and identity in Black learners' mathematical experiences. K. Subramanian, fondly known as Ravi. Ravi is a professor at the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai, India. He researches the design and organization of core areas of middle grade mathematics curriculum and integration of out-of-school knowledge and the specialized knowledge teachers need to teach effectively. He has contributed extensively to the work of curriculum and textbook committees and to in-service teacher professional development across India. Our two respondents are Professor Yoshinori Shimizu and Professor Renuka Vithal. Yoshi is from the University of Tsukuba in Japan, and Renuka is from the University of Forte, South Africa. So they've been invited as the co-chairs of the ICMA study, School Mathematics Curriculum Reform, Challenges, Changes, and Opportunities. Their study topic, as we see, coheres well with the topic of our panel and our grapplings. Their work is captured in the ICMA study volume, which will also be presented here at ICME 14. And so we are here to provoke conversation. Our panelists and respondents share insights and questions related to these two connected aspects. They're going to contribute voices and perspectives from diverse geographical backgrounds and research interests and expertise. And our plan is to stimulate discussion and begin conversations that we will continue to grapple with post-ICME 14. Before commencing, and in the interest of time, the panelists and I say a collective thank you to the ICME, IPC, and the LOC for this invitation. And we thank our respondents for their contributions. So we say a collective thank you, Shishi. Over to you, Marcelo.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. That's the new normal. I was invited to talk on this panel about the role of media and things in mathematics education post-2020. And it's my great pleasure to be here. And reducing inequality is one of the goals for sustainable development. But social inequality is a problem around the world. The economic disparity is huge. Pandemic has brought the need to incorporate digital technology in mathematics education. But teachers in school were not prepared in general. Differences in readiness brought even more difference, according to the paper that I published with some of my colleagues. Domestication of media. Look, in Brazil, we do have research into digital technology and mathematics education for more than 25 years, but very little use of its results in the classroom. Is this true in your country as well? Policy rarely deals with issues other than large test results. And large tests usually do not allow for the use of digital technology or assessing it. Different kinds of online mathematics education were practiced, from domesticated one to creative ones. But please, Marcelo, can you tell me more about what do you mean by domestication? Sure. So in this paper that I mentioned before, we talked that when one suddenly has to transfer to an entirely new teaching environment, many teachers tend to just convert their traditional courses to an online platform. We have labeled that a domestication of new media. One does not take advantage of the agents of a new medium and simply use practice from teaching with the old medium. Examples of domestication, of course, teachers use the internet just to do what I'm doing now, just to record as a regular class. Or you may as well just go and use something like a send school exercise. But if you have the PowerPoint and the camera, you're already doing a little bit more. But if you have dynamic mathematics, then you have more. And you might be able to explain to a much larger public than usually university students or advanced high school students that the sigmoid is important, that the sigmoid is used to model the way that the pandemic can become a huge problem. And so you teach them about the red curve, and you show them that derivative at a given moment for different sigmoids are different blue curves. And if you have these different blue curves like this, you might be able to discuss with them why it's important to flatten the curve. So flatten the curve means saving lives, and you can show that mathematically. And you can argue with them and show that the sigmoid and its derivative is full of exponential functions, and that exponential functions are also important to what? To understand social inequality, to understand that the richer is getting richer exponentially, and the poor is getting poorer exponentially, and that the social disparity is growing exponentially. So it might be important, for you to teach your kids how to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but also 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and backwards, 64, 32, 16. These might be important. We need to be teaching exponential functions from very early ages to everyone. And look, digital technology can help you with that. And digital technology can reduce or can increase inequality. I just gave an example that you use digital technology to discuss mathematically the pandemic to much more people. But if we do consider a view of knowledge, that knowledge is produced by collectors of humans with media, as myself and others defend, so we do have different knowledge if we have orality, the voice, paper and pencil, computers, in this collective that we know. When we have a software design, we like better one cell phone and not another. The pandemic of online mathematics education to all has shown that now, besides the different media and the different design, we have different things incorporated to it. And this notion of humans with media becomes important because media now is extended to a much larger view. It goes beyond digital technology and includes things. But what kind of things? We're going to talk about this, but we need to know that things now have ages. The corona has transformed our lives in 2020, and now we cannot build back better with such inequality because now we have homes and we have quality of the internet. We cannot have all this social difference and have equal opportunity for math education. So we must have math education together with social inequality. We have a huge difference in the new cultural capital that includes not only the education of the parents and the inheritance in the community, but also includes now the quality of the internet and homes. Do you have any doubt about it? Well, we think that quality mathematics education for building back betters need to incorporate things. And we're not going to be able to, after 2020, with this kind of education that include my home, look, welcome to my home, but not everyone can transform the dining room into an office. Many people live 5, 6 people, in just a two-room house, and this has bringing an immense amount of inequality. So we need clean water, yes, important goal. We need sanitation, yes, but we need internet to all, and we need homes to all. Do we have any doubt that things are important for learning? Which house would you like to be in? In the fancy building or in the slums? In those houses I just mentioned with two rooms for everyone. So this is very important. We think that the digital technology can also, in the pandemic, maybe bring non-domesticated practice to schools. For instance, we can incentivize students to produce videos, not only to watch videos, but for them to produce video that it's going to become mathematics educational content for their peers, for the ones who are younger than them, and the teacher can use to assess them. Not necessarily to grade, but to tell this is right, and why don't you do this, and why don't you do that? So we can transform education with the active role of digital technology in homes. And maybe if we have videos from different communities, we're going to be bringing a lot of problems and a lot of diversity into math educations. I've been working in this research project for 5-6 years now, and we have students making videos such as this. Please go to my channel in the YouTube, the GPI channel, and take a look at this. It's a tragedy that happened before the pandemic. The video has subtitles in English, so please go there and check it out. How students, 12, 13-year-old, were able to make advanced mathematics, level curves and all kinds of things to deal with this problem. Paulo Freire has said, if education alone does not transform society, neither does society change without education. You can also read in Portuguese if you want. But with such inequality, can we achieve mathematics education for all? Without mathematics education for all, can we overcome inequality? Without understanding of exponential functions linked to the mathematics of the pandemic, can collective of student teachers with media be prepared for the next pandemic? I think you know my answers, but I'm interested in your answer. For some reference, you can have the PowerPoint. If you have more questions, please send it to me. And I would like to thank you all. And that was very, very nice having a chance of address the ICME audience.
Thank you, Marcelo, for that really interesting presentation. Over to you, Eva.
A big hello from Berlin to everyone. For my input, I'd like to focus on the question of how can, or perhaps how should, mathematics be used in communicating an urgent need for action. These are my starting points. In contexts of crises, numbers, quantities, metrics, or indicators emanating from mathematical models and simulations play an important role in what counts as a rational public discourse. These numbers are used, first, to communicate the reality behind something that happens, of which we see only some symptoms. Second, to predict what will continue to happen if no action is taken. And third, what would happen if particular actions were taken. Based on these observations, I'll address two questions. Are there particular strategies in the use of numbers in public discourse? And how should the use of numbers in communicating political priorities enter mathematics education? Let me first jump back in time to a fictitious situation of crisis. In 1947, the French author and philosopher Albert Camus wrote the novel La Peste. He tells the story of an epidemic in a quarantine city. In the beginning of the epidemic, when regular broadcasting of the official statistics started, the reaction of the public was slower than might have been expected. Thus, the bare statement that 302 deaths had taken place in the third week of plague failed to strike their imagination. A new phase of the epidemic was ushered in when the radio announced no longer weekly totals, but that's in a day. The fictitious chronicler comments, "The newspapers and the authorities are playing ball with the plague. They fancy they are scoring off it." So now back again in 2020, we can ask, what has changed in the public use of mathematics? There has been a dramatic increase in the use of mathematical models across academic fields, and speedy computations with massive data are used in decision-making across a range of social practices. This development has resulted in policy decisions that heavily rely on numbers, quantitative metrics, and indicators provided by experts. How much experts are involved depends on the type of political system. And we do not listen to numbers in the radio anymore, but face black-boxed mathematics in the form of a wide variety of visual representations of complex data, such as graphs, charts, maps, and diagrams, and interactive tools, all designed to inform an audience with more or less expert knowledge. In this context, inequality relates to differences in the quality of the numbers and the visualizations between the so-called prestigious and popular media outlets. And in addition to inequality of access, there are differences in the knowledge base of the targeted audience. As an example, I'd like to look at the public discourse in Germany during the first epidemic wave of COVID-19 in 2020, with its peak in early April. In this discourse, all of the before mentioned was present. A variety of key metrics was used: cases, new cases, incidents, deaths, case fatality rate, excess mortality, recovered doubling time, R-value. It started with quite simple metrics, and then the range increased and the measures became more complex and so also more difficult to interpret. But how then were these metrics used? In a systematic study, we identified different strategies of using numbers to communicate an urgent need for action and to defend the rules and regulations directed to contain the spread of the virus. Rationalization is the strategy one expects in a rational policy discourse that relies on experts from science. It consists in the use of quantity metrics or indicators in factual statements for providing evidence, in arguments and in explanations, that is, elements of scientific discourse from the relevant fields, as a basis for suggesting policy measures. Metrics, for example, were used for setting benchmarks and for the argument of flattening the curve to avoid overload of healthcare systems and provide enough intensive care units. But there were also other strategies. As Camus observed, numbers don't strike people's imagination. One was the use of contrast. It works by comparing numbers and establishing a stark contrast in terms of high and low by invoking emotions on one side of the comparison. For example, a looming menace associated with high numbers. For example, in the beginning, this was used for denying a crisis. High numbers of infected in Italy were used to show how low the numbers in Germany still were, and so nothing needed to be done. Association also invokes affect and fantasy, but here metrics are not compared, but combined with representations of concrete events, objects, behaviors, etc., seen as equivalent with overcoming the crisis or hindering this. For example, some metrics combine with images of crowds of young people so that one associates these as responsible for high numbers. Recharging consists in presenting concrete examples of first-hand experiences, personal narratives, testimonies, individual fates, etc. behind the metrics. So the numbers become recharged with subjectivity and materiality that has been eliminated through the mathematization. Similar use of mathematics is made in public discourse in other contexts that heavily rely on complex data such as in policy fields that relate to the Sustainable Development Goals. There are some examples. First, this one is about global urbanization. The aim is to show the scales of urban change from 1985 to 2015. What I want to point out here is that such visualizations are based on complex data that would be impossible to communicate in any other way. The topic certainly relates to Goal 11 on sustainable cities and communities. Second, this example is from the public website of the German Aerospace Center. It shows a complex visualization of the corona effect on air quality. This effect refers to the reduction in air pollution as an outcome of lockdown measures in 2020 as compared to 2019. There has been a dispute whether this is only a weather effect or really due to the reduced traffic and industrial activities during the lockdown. For this visualization, they have adjusted the data for the weather, and one still can see the positive effect on air quality for 2020. And finally, this example obviously relates to Goal 13 on climate action. In this example, this is from a public report of the United Nations Refugee Agency on migration and displacement of people. In this and similar reports, one can see that the strategy of recharging is used. It includes individual fates of displaced people to let the numbers speak. There are several goals to which migration is related. To summarize, in all my examples, the underlying mathematical models originate from academic contexts. In many public reports of supranational institutions, NGOs, and local campaigns of policy actors who communicate the urgency of some political action, we find black-boxed mathematics in form of visualizations and strategies of communication similar to those found in the context of the pandemic. These are necessary when the data are too complex and also because numbers never speak for themselves. So there are important questions to be asked in mathematics education as research and as practice. Question 1. If more locally relevant topics related to sustainable development goals are included in the teaching of mathematical modeling and statistics, how can we find a balance between simplifying the socio-political complexity of the problems and focusing on mathematically important issue? Question 2. Where is the space in the curriculum for dealing with black-boxed mathematics in the form of visualizations? Question 3. Shall mathematics still be taught as neutral tool and mathematics educators try to avoid appealing to affect, emotion or fantasy? Or shall we include discussions of strategies and the art of using numbers for getting a political message across? Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for those key and novel insights. Over to you, Danny.
Hello, everyone, and warm greetings from Chicago. As Mellony stated, my name is Danny Martin. I'm a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. In this presentation, I'll be addressing the question, is the future of mathematics education Black? My decision to frame the future of mathematics education in the United States in this way is partially shaped by my positionality as a Black man in America. In this country, I belong to a group whose bottom-level status in the social hierarchy has been fortified in law, policy, practice, and reform for more than 400 years. The last 18 months of extrajudicial killings of Black people by police, the disproportionate effects of COVID-19, and efforts to disenfranchise Black voters serve as visible reminders of this bottom-level status. While many people across the globe may have been shocked by the recent killings of Black people by American police or by the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black people, the year 2020 was in many respects completely normal for Black people. The data projected in these two graphics are not aberrations. Going back 10, 20, or even 100 years would reveal similar outcomes in many different areas of Black life. Therefore, my thoughts about the future of mathematics education cannot ignore the realities of the past and the present, and they cannot be confined to issues of teaching, learning, curriculum, or assessment. Against the backdrop of these observations, let me say a bit more about the title of my talk. My claim today is that there is no future for mathematics education in the United States if a reimagined mathematics education does not value the lives and humanity of Black people, contribute to their collective liberation and flourishing, and stand in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. If not, the future of mathematics education will continue to reflect the past and the present. In America, the past and the present reflect the fact that despite decades of curriculum and teaching reform, many Black children continue to experience dehumanizing and violent forms of mathematics education. These dehumanizing and violent experiences are rooted in systems of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. Now, invoking white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism should not be viewed as unnecessary provocation. Historical analysis shows that they are foundational to the birth of America, and they continue to undergird almost every American institution. In many ways, white supremacy is a thread that holds America together, stitching together the past, the present, and the future. Invoking anti-Blackness provides a necessary language to explain the particularities of Black oppression and the willingness of American institutions to dehumanize Black people and inflict gratuitous violence. Also, racial capitalism helps to explain how Black pain, Black suffering, and fabrications of Black pathology continue to serve as commodities for capital accumulation. During chattel slavery, for example, the bodies of Black people were considered property, and their free labor generated much of America's wealth. More than 150 years later, the marginalization of Black people in mathematics has resulted in a proliferation of what I would call intervention economies, focused on fixing Black learners and increasing their achievement and participation in mathematics. The persistence of Black racial oppression in America over the past 400 years also serves as a reminder that white supremacy is a self-correcting system that has resisted every effort to dismantle it. As noted by the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, white supremacy is a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it. And so we must imagine a new country. In my opinion, if America cannot be reformed away from white supremacy, then the same is true for mathematics education. I can modify the quote from earlier to say, white supremacy is a force so fundamental to mathematics education that it is difficult to imagine mathematics education without it. And so we must imagine a new mathematics education. Also, confronting the realities of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism in mathematics education also means confronting the myths and realities of Black inclusion and the myths that are perpetuated about reform. This slide shows that after steady increases from the late 1980s to the early 1990s, the percentage of Black mathematics majors, represented by the red curve, has actually decreased during the past 25 years and stabilized to around 5%. This time frame from the late 1980s to the current time coincides with several mathematics education reforms in the US. Many of these reforms focused on issues of diversity and inclusion. This next slide shows that over the same time frame, the number of Black mathematics majors at US universities, represented by the blue curve, has remained relatively flat. So in the context of these two curves at least, Black inclusion into mathematics is actually a myth. My research and the work of several colleagues has documented other realities and material consequences of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism for Black learners in math education. In very recent work, we discuss how Black learners encounter and negotiate various forms of violence, including epistemological violence, systemic violence, and symbolic violence. For example, we show how knowledge production often reifies the idea of Black inferiority in mathematics by using statistics as a proxy for truth. Drawing on the work of Thomas Teo, we frame this as epistemological violence. We also show how school-based mathematical practices limit Black students' access to identities as creators and doers of mathematics, often reserving these identities for white and Asian learners. We link these practices to symbolic violence. Next, consider this study published in 2014. It was a longitudinal analysis of mathematics placement profiles of Black students and white students from late elementary school through 8th grade. The authors analyzed the impact of teacher evaluation of student performance versus student demonstrated performance on the odds of being placed into algebra in the 8th grade. Please note that in the United States, algebra serves as an important gateway and gatekeeper course to more advanced mathematics and other prized educational opportunities. Results of this study revealed that Black students had reduced odds of being placed in algebra by the time they entered 8th grade, even after controlling for performance in mathematics. The odds of placement in algebra by 8th grade for Black students were reduced by 2/3 to 2/5 compared to their white peers. The authors concluded, Black students confront an untenable impediment in that their Blackness, or as we suggest here, the teacher's implicit responses to these students' Blackness, is an invisible obstacle to gaining access to high-level mathematics courses, irrespective of the demonstrated performance. In other words, meeting and exceeding standards are not enough to counterbalance anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Now, let me be clear that I'm not making an argument for inclusion into mathematics as it currently stands. If inclusion means inclusion into a system that's fundamentally anti-Black, I cannot support that. So building back better and reform post-2020 must mean more than inclusion into mathematics as it is. Rather, the focus should be on building a humane, anti-racist mathematics education free of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. Now, why is mathematics education in the US not stood in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism? Let me make this claim. And I want to claim that math education reforms in the US have always been aligned with political projects promoting white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism, along with a number of other social forces. What is the evidence for this claim? This table is a very simple depiction showing how various math education reforms in the US have co-evolved with the prevailing political and racial projects. In a recent paper, I provide a more detailed analysis of how the political and racial projects in column 3 have always enlisted the math education reforms promoted in column 1. Likewise, the reforms in column 1 have always supported the prevailing racial and political projects in column 3. For example, the new math reforms of the 1950s and 60s unfolded at the same time that America was in the midst of legalized racial segregation. Those new math reforms were not intended for Black Americans, and there is no historical evidence that math education stood in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. More than 70 years later, US math education is in the midst of what we call here the Common Core reform era, and America at large finds itself entangled in the racial politics that led to the election of Donald Trump, the Black Lives Matter movement, COVID, white supremacist insurrection, and the transition to the Biden presidency. Now, given the accumulation and persistence of racial and political projects in column 3 and ongoing commitments to reform, what is the future of math education? So rather than asking, is the future of mathematics education Black, I now suggest that the future of mathematics education in the US at least must be Black. Math education in the United States has no future if it does not value the lives and humanity of Black people and contribute to their collective liberation and flourishing. There must be an agenda to build Black futures and forms of math education that stand in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. Now, before closing this presentation, I want to acknowledge that the realities of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism in America do not map neatly onto other locations around the globe. Even in those contexts where race is socially and politically significant, such as South Africa and Brazil. However, the meanings, processes, and material consequences of race and racism are different in these 3 locations, for example. However, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism are still very salient in all 3 locations. Let me also be clear that even in those contexts where it is believed that race is not an issue because, quote, there are no Black people here, unquote, critical questions can and should be raised. Some of those questions appear here, and I invite you to engage with them after the presentation. I also want to leave this presentation with a couple of other questions here that may come up for conversation and discussion. Given that many reform movements ultimately uphold the status quo, is it possible to reform math education in America so that it stands in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism? And also, what do radically reimagined futures of math education that center the needs of the socially, politically, and economically disadvantaged and marginalized people look like? And this applies to across the globe. So with these questions, I'll end my presentation and say thank you for your patience and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Danny, for that thought-provoking presentation. Over to you, Ravi.
Hello and good day. Greetings from Mumbai. I'd like to speak today on can mathematics education help reduce inequality? Let me begin by asking what conversations do we as mathematics educators currently prioritize? What conversations do we need to prioritize? The pandemic has affected the lives of many deeply. I will use this opportunity not so much to look back on my previous work, but to interrupt it with questions that the experience of the last year throws up. The issues I raise, the questions I ask are connected to SDG 4, Quality Education for All, SDG 10, Reduced Inequalities, and SDG 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions. The pandemic sharpened the inequality across the world. Countries like India, with deeply entrenched inequality, were particularly hard hit. About 90% of the Indian workforce is in the informal economy. Many millions of Indian workers lost their jobs and had to walk hundreds of kilometers to return to their home states. About 400 million Indians risk falling deeper into poverty due to the lockdown. Does this mean that everybody suffered because of the pandemic? No, that's not true. Here is a shocking fact. The wealth of the top 10 billionaires in the world increased by nearly 50% over a period of 10 months during the pandemic. In India, the top 11 billionaires increased their wealth by 80%. In fact, one billionaire increased his wealth threefold, by 3 times. Does this huge suddenly acquired wealth for some bring any hope to the rest of the people who need support? Not at all. Rather than tax the wealthy, at least the government in India, for this government, the preferred route is to increase the tax on fuel by pushing the burden downward. My co-panelists have spoken about educational and social inequality. Clearly, inequality, whether economic or social, will not really be overcome without democratic political struggle by those who are marginalized. The period of the pandemic has also seen large-scale people's protests in several countries. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, the farm protests in India, the movement to restore democracy in Myanmar, and in many other countries. Even if these movements were possibly unrelated to the pandemic, they are worthy of our attention. Indeed, these political movements were opportunities for us educators to be educated. As educators, we often do not remember the connection between education and social or political movements. Such movements are often occasions for mass education. How can we restore the connection between social movements and the education curriculum? What does this mean for mathematics education? In India, the protesting farmers, many hundreds of thousands of them, demanded the repeal of laws that were thought to favor corporates and put farmers' futures at risk. The movement shone the torch not only on the issues related to farm income, but also on issues like ecological degradation and the control of the public sphere by manipulating social media. These are important issues for education that's aimed at transforming society. In developing countries with widespread inequality and poverty, the agenda of social transformation becomes one of the primary aims of education. In India, caste is a pervasive form of social inequality. A person is born into a caste and is locked into it for life. In fact, many authors, many thinkers have compared caste in India to race in other countries. Ambedkar, who himself came from the lowest caste, the Dalit caste, is a great leader of the Dalits, emphasized the role of education in the emancipation of the lower castes. Quote, "Coming as I do from the lowest order of the Hindu society, I know what is the value of education. The problem of raising the lower order is deemed to be economic. This is a great mistake. The problem of the lower order is to create in them a consciousness of the significance of their lives for themselves and for their country, of which they have been cruelly robbed by the existing social order. Nothing can achieve this except the spread of higher education." Unquote. Clearly, education, as Ambedkar says, has a great role to play in social transformation. But what about mathematics education? How can mathematics education help meet the goal of reducing inequality and of social transformation? Of course, mathematics opens up the paths to highly valued jobs. It functions like a gate, which is important for transforming a caste society, because a caste society has very rigid and strict occupational boundaries. So to break out of those occupational strictures is important, and mathematics can create a gateway for that. But Ambedkar emphasized not only material gain from education, but also gaining self-respect and self-understanding. Critical mathematics education researchers from many different places have shown how mathematics can help sharpen our perception and understanding with inequality and the structures that underpin it. They have also called attention to the deeper ways in which mathematical algorithms format the world we live in, the mathematization of society and the demathematization of mathematical knowledge, for example. Why then is there so little of such use of mathematics in the curriculum and in our teaching? I would like to show here an example from the grade 5 textbook, mathematics textbook, primary school, produced after major reforms in India. In this example, there is a couple shown who are farm laborers. It is mentioned that the government pays rupees 71 as the minimum wage per day. However, this couple, the man is paid less than that, rupees 58, and the woman is paid rupees 55. The question asks them to find how much money they will earn for a certain number of days, both the man and the woman, and to find the total. But more importantly, let me focus here on the questions at the bottom. One of the questions asks, he does not give them the minimum wage, and there's a question mark. Another question asks, and why does he pay less to Tulsi and more to her husband? Discuss. Why less to the woman and more to the man? Discuss. Now, when Shika Tucker, who did a study of classroom teaching, found in a study that teachers often omitted these questions which occur at the bottom. This is from the grade 5 textbook. Now, firstly, I'd like to say that even the inclusion of such questions in the textbook is remarkable because it is so rare. It's an exception. Teachers often omit the supplementary questions and give various reasons for omitting them. One of the teachers told Shika at one time that she would like to focus on the mathematics and avoid distractions, and these questions seemed to her like distractions. Another time, the teacher said that she did not feel equipped to deal with it. She did not feel capable of handling the discussion which she felt might come once she brought up these questions. Now, we can also imagine that there is resistance to raise questions having political undertones. It may even carry sometimes, in some situations, real risks for teachers. But we, as mathematics education researchers, still need to ask, can we continue to ignore these dimensions if we are serious about reducing inequality? I'd like to say that in this example, the mathematics involved is simple. It is just comparison of numbers. In my earlier example of the rich becoming richer, during the pandemic, we just used percentages and ratios, elementary multiplicative comparisons. Even though the mathematics involved is not sophisticated, the application to understanding social reality can be powerful. Even though the mathematics is simple, the socioeconomic and socio-political concepts involved may be sophisticated. Sometimes the emphasis on important mathematics in curriculum reform can lead to giving less importance to such applications of mathematics which are powerful. Finally, let me raise some questions. Do we need to revisit our notion of what constitutes mathematics to allow for socially meaningful questions to be raised? Why does the use of mathematics to understand social reality appear as a distraction? Do our notions of powerful mathematics conflict with powerful uses of mathematics? Why does our curriculum not make any connection to social movements? Finally, while the mathematics curriculum typically makes at least some connections with the science curriculum, why does it make so little connection with the social science curriculum? Here are some references, and thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for a really interesting presentation. We will now turn to our two respondents, Yoshinori and Renuka.
Hello, my name is Yoshinori Shimizu from Japan. It is my great pleasure to be invited as a respondent to this important panel discussion. And together with my colleague, Renuka, we'd like to share with you some experiences and lessons from this particular study, ICME Study 24. This is a theme, school mathematics curriculum reforms around the world. The study conference was held in November 2018, And we have a participants, roughly 100 from 28 country and region. There is a ICME 14 session on ICME studies, which was held July 14. You might not attend this particular session, but today, due to the time limitation, I like just to skip the detail of this particular study. We have 5 themes: historical perspectives, coherence and relevance in content, and the implementation issues in general, and the globalization and internationalization, and then agent and the processes. These broader issues were explored. But I'd like to share some lessons learned. And first of all, both curriculum and curriculum reforms are very complex themselves. Morgan Smith, for example, defined the curriculum as a 6-dimensional vector space with goals, content, materials, and forms of teaching, student activities, and assessment. Very complex in the nature. And this raises the question of drawing on general education versus mathematics education's limited literatures as the area of scholarship and practice. It should be noted that the study conference of ICME 24 was held before the COVID-19, but some of the key learning points from the study can still be suitable to the question addressed in this panel discussion. The context of mathematics curriculum reform around the world vary significantly, and we need to study the mechanism involved in the cases of reform in such various contexts to learn to what extent curricula that address social inequalities could be developed, implemented, and evaluated. The COVID-19 let us reflect on the old and new issues in school mathematics curriculum reform. School mathematics curriculum reform is a key to better quality and equitable mathematics teaching and learning. We just confirmed this key message. And some new perspective appeared. General trends in school mathematics curriculum reform is from content to competencies. And we had a chapter from Miho Taguma, who is an OECD senior specialist, and Educacion 2030 learning compasses and its implications for mathematics curriculum. New perspectives is needed on developing and implementing competency-based curriculum in response to the VUCA, so-called word, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and so on. For instance, student agency, which is defined as a capacity to set a goal, to reflect on, and to act responsibility to effective change. Maybe this is related to the using mathematics to communicate various issues, as I ever was talking. And quality of textbooks and resources does matter in teaching and learning in general, and in the online and remote teaching and learning in particular. The lack of research should be noted about the affordances and the constraints of digital materials and on student use of resources in relation to curriculum reform intentions. Is a race taking place between the quality of digital technology and education? This is related to the issue of reduction of inequality, as Marcelo addressed in his talk. Cases reported in the study volume tell us that teachers are at the core among multiple agents in implementing curriculum reforms. So enhancing teachers' capacities in response to the changes due to the pandemic, for example, in particular, is the key for the curriculum reform. So teacher education and professional development will be appeared again as a key issues.
This is what we like to share with you. Thank you, and 谢谢.
It is my privilege and pleasure to respond to this very relevant and important panel on maths education reforms post-2020 conversations towards building back better. I'm going to be sharing some reflections from the ICME study 24 on school mathematics curriculum reforms around the world, which has already been introduced by Yoshi. So in this presentation, I want to start by maybe questioning whether we really will be able to build back better, perhaps, maybe, but we would definitely be building back differently. I do think that historically, we will speak of a time before 2020 and post-2020 as a profound period that will likely have significantly altered how we think about and do maths education. So in this presentation, there are three aspects I would like to speak to, which arise from the study and have relevance to the points raised by the panelists. The first is on technology, an obvious choice, and I want to expand on the point that Yoshi has already made, in that the study, although conceptualized before 2020, already recognized the importance of technology in curriculum reforms. And as Mellony has pointed out, the shift to remote and multimodal learning is now accelerated. And this acceleration, I think, is a double-edged benefit. On the one hand, the provision of technology in the form of laptops and other devices has increased, perhaps unprecedentedly. In South Africa, for example, these have been made available to learners across backgrounds, while structural inequalities in connectivity and conditions for learning have deepened. And I think this is a very relevant point to what Marcelo has been talking about, in that it will create a different divide for the kind of learning that different learners are likely to access. Related to technology is curriculum reforms in new content, in particular shifts towards including computational thinking or algorithmic thinking, which are likely to be accelerated. So we've observed this reform across countries now as new reforms are implemented, being introduced even at the primary level. That's likely to be accelerated. And with this shift, there's also likely a much more significant swing towards applications in mathematics, which have been observed, and we will see more of those shifts going forward. The point then about who and what drives mathematics curriculum reforms is quite a key one in respect of the agents of curriculum reforms. And here, related to this point, is the recognition of different literacies and competences that are needed. The point Ava was making about dealing with black boxes, which, for example, is evident in how COVID-related data is made available to the general public, has increased a focus on the kinds of literacies needed to understand those changes. And with that, we have seen this focus on literacies emerging from international studies like PISA and TIMSS, and with these international studies has been huge movement in importing or exporting maths curricula across countries, and the role of the media and politics in how mathematics curriculum reforms happen. So certainly as we go forward, the uncertainty and the difficulty of predicting the future for maths education reforms and through maths education reforms will be a challenge. And finally, a comment that has come out as a strong point in the research in the study around the deficit in research on maths curriculum reforms. Jeremy Kilpatrick quote that while we have an enormous amount of curriculum development, we do not have the same amount of curriculum development research is particularly relevant here. And the point is that although we have a lot of maths educators or a number of maths educators participating in or leading maths curriculum reforms, that has not necessarily translated into in-depth scholarly publications on macro level initiatives. And the need for theoretical developments as well as research methodologies has been identified in the study, as well as the difficulties of undertaking such studies. So the point that both that Danny were making and Ravi were making really open for a discussion that if we really want to influence maths curriculum reforms, then we do need to find ways to participate much more deeply and shape maths education reform efforts, as well as study them, both as insiders and outsiders. Thank you.